10 pests of Egypt were judgments on the part of God sent against the Egyptians, so that they knew that he is the Lord. While the pests were sent, Pharaoh refused to free the Hebrews, and it was only after the 10th plague that the children of Israel could leave from Egypt. In this video, you will understand the meaning of each of the 10 pests sent to Egypt. We can start by talking what were the 10 pests sent to Egypt. And according to the biblical text, the 10 pests were blood, frogs, lice, flies, pests on herds, ulcers, rain of stones, grasshoppers, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. But before the 10 plagues were sent, Moses and Aaron, with the order of the Lord, went to Pharaoh to let the people of Israel leave. But God had already warned them that Pharaoh would not listen to them, so he would put his hand over Egypt. And that's how the first plague was spilled. And in the first plague, the waters of Egypt became blood. Here it is important to know that the Nile River was not the only one affected by this first plague. All channels, lagoons, and water reservoirs in Egypt were also hit by the plague. And at this point, some people argue that this plague consisted only of the transformation of the waters into a red color. These people claim that this may have happened by the mix of the red clay that descended from the tall lands of Ethiopia. However, the original Hebrew term applied in this biblical text is never used in the Bible to denote red color, but always to indicate blood as substance. So yes, in the first plague, the waters were not only dyed red, but were transformed into blood. And that was something very impactful because besides being the source of Egypt's agricultural life, the Nile River was worshipped as a kind of deity. So when God wounded the waters of that river, it also meant a direct attack on the pantheon of the Egyptian gods. However, the Bible says, the wizards of Egypt managed to imitate this plague and Pharaoh was hardened. Already in the second plague, many frogs from Rio and all the channels of that land invaded Egypt. With this plague, Pharaoh asked Moses and Aaron to pray to the Lord that the frogs would be taken from the houses of the Egyptians. He also promised to free the people, however. Shortly after the end of the second plague, Pharaoh continued with a hardened heart. And here it is important to know that in Egyptian religious culture, frogs represented a goddess. And then combined with the fact that the river was producing such frogs, it meant that two sacred elements of Egyptian paganism were representing them misfortunes. But even so, the wizards of Egypt also managed to imitate the second plague. Following, the Bible shows that in the third plague, the earth's dust was transformed into a lice epidemic that infested Egypt. This time, the Egyptian wizards even tried to imitate this plague, but they couldn't. And they had to admit that really what was happening there was a true divine intervention. But despite this, Pharaoh remained hardened, just as the Lord had spoken. Following, the fourth plague consisted of flies' swarms that punished all the Egyptians. However, the flies did not reach the Israelites, and during this plague, Pharaoh even tried to negotiate an agreement with Moses. He wanted the people of Israel to worship God in Egypt himself. But Moses refused this proposal and warned him that the people of Israel had to make a journey through the desert for more than 3 days, without anything and no one behind. Initially, Pharaoh seemed willing to give in. However, as soon as the swimming disappeared, Pharaoh ended up hardened again. Already the fifth plague was a terrible pestilence that hit the herds of the Egyptians who were in the field. This plague killed the horses, donkeys, camels, sheep, and cattle in general. And for the execution of this plague, God designated right specific time, namely, the next day. And just like the fourth plague, the Israelites' herds were not hit, and this fact caused Pharaoh to investigate the case. But his heart hardened even more. And then came the sixth plague, when God commanded Moses and Aaron to catch a handful of oven ash and throw it to the sky in the presence of Pharaoh. And when they did this, all the men and animals of Egypt were punished with ulcers, including the wizards who at the beginning of the 10 pests tried to imitate them. And even in the face of all this suffering, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not leave the people of Israel to leave. Then in the seventh plague, God made an unprecedented rain of stones upon Egypt. That rain of stones mixed with fire was not natural, but something that revealed God's sovereignty over all creation. But before, God also warned that anyone who wanted to survive, to retreat in their home. And some of the officers of Pharaoh, having already learned to fear the word of the Lord, collected their servants and cattle in safe places. The rain of stones then punished all the Egypt, but left the land where the children of Israel were unharmed. And with this plague, Pharaoh begged for relief. He also admitted a possible blame on his part and promised to free the people of Israel. However, when the rain of stones stopped, again, he hardened his heart. In the next chapter of the book of Exodus, we read about the 8th plague that brought a countless number of grasshoppers over Egypt. These locusts devoured everything that had left after the 7th plague, so that there was no green in the trees. But before Egypt was punished by grasshoppers, Pharaoh tried to negotiate another deal with Moses. However, the proposal was rejected, and the locusts covered the entire land of Egypt. Pharaoh then ordered Moses once more and confessed to having sinned. He asked Moses to pray to the Lord so that the grasshoppers to remove, but in the end he ended up hardened. And then the 9th plague was spilled. And in the 9th plague, God sent thick darkness upon Egypt for 3 days. This was not a type of sunstorm or eclipse as some people think, but of supernatural darkness originated directly from divine intervention. And that was very interesting because the Egyptians celebrated the light of dawn as an act of victory of the sun god about the serpent of chaos and darkness. So when those dense darkness covered Egypt, it meant a clear demonstration of the superiority of the God of Israel over the Egyptian pantheon. On the other hand, the Israelites were the only ones who had light where they inhabited. And once again, Pharaoh tried to negotiate with Moses a release of the people of Israel to go to the desert to worship the Lord. But as other times, he ended up hardened to the point of ordering Moses to leave his presence under the threat of killing him if he saw him again. And all these events prepared a scenario for 10th plague. The 10th plague was the conclusion of the divine judgment on Egypt. At that time, all the firstborn of Egypt, from men to animals, were killed when the Lord injured them. But before that, God gave Moses specific instructions on how the Israelites should proceed. And this occasion resulted in the celebration of the first Easter. Then, according to the biblical text, the children of Israel put the blood of the sacrificed lambs in their doors as God had commanded them. And in this way, God's judgment has passed over his homes without any of his firstborn. And as a result of the 10th plague, Pharaoh and all the people of Egypt supplicated that the Israelites would leave. And in the face of this story, many people question why God sent the 10 pests to Egypt. About this, the biblical text shows us that God sent the 10 plagues about Egypt to demonstrate his great power and that your name may be glorified throughout the earth. Even some people forget that approximately 500 years before the 10 pests are sent, God spoke to Abraham about the future of his offspring. The Lord warned him that his offspring would be enslaved, but he would judge the oppressive nation. Therefore, in this respect, the 10 pests of Egypt also emphasize that God is the one who rules history according to his purposes. But beyond this main meaning, we can understand that with the 10 pests of Egypt, God humbles the pantheon of the false gods of that people. And in this way, the Lord has shown that he is the only true God. He even uses the alleged deities of men as an instrument of his judgment. And this was very clear, especially in the 1st, 2nd, and 9th plague, when the symbols of the Egyptian deities were used to bring them punishment. Through the 10 pests, the Lord also showed that even may man try to imitate his power, he will never. This can be seen from the 3rd plague, when the wizards were no longer able to reproduce them. Satan can even do his alleged miracles, but his power can never be compared to the power of the Lord. With the 10 plagues, God also showed that he has a personal care for those whom he chooses. Especially from the 4th plague, we can see the emphasis that is given to the immune condition of the Israelites in the face of divine punishment. The 10 plagues also showed that God controls all nature. He turned powder into lice, controlled as he wanted to swarms of flies and grasshoppers, poured a rain of stones, and also caused dense darkness to cover Egypt. In the spill of the 10 plagues, God also showed that he is the Lord over all diseases. He caused ulcers to punish the Egyptians and a pestilence decreased their flocks. In the 10 pests, there is still a very clear revelation that God is the one who gives man the maintenance. Yes, the God who had given abundance of maintenance to Egypt in Joseph's time also showed that without his mercy man cannot even be sustained. The false gods of the Egyptians could not rid their flocks and plantations when God poured their judgment upon them. And finally, the 10 plagues about Egypt show that God is the one who has control over life and death. And this truth became clear mainly in the 10th plague, when all the Egyptian firstborn were killed and the Hebrew firstborn were spared. And with that, all 10 plagues showed not only to the Egyptians, but to the Israelites themselves, who is the Almighty God.
My friend, making it to the end is no small thing. It shows you cared enough to go beyond the surface. If this touched you in any way, subscribe, comment your city and country, and share it with someone who might benefit from these ideas. Thanks, a big hug, and see you in the next video.